Okay. So now hopefully that's going to be, okay, it's up here. Hopefully it's broadcasting. Okay. So now let's. Okay, so we don't have any music in here, so that's good. Here, let's still music in here?
I hear it.
Is it this thing or I don't know? Okay, and everybody has.
Here, for the third time, you're going to explain this, so maybe I might get it.
That's only the second time we had this lecture.
I did it 3 times. You did it once at the consignment place.
Yeah.
You gave it once at Boulders down here.
Did I get lots of boulders?
Yeah, you talked about this. Yeah, kind of this. I've seen this handout.
Okay.
This is the 3rd time I think I've seen
All
it.
right. Well, 3rd time's the charm.
Well, but I'm a little dense. So.
Well, in the case of me wanting to fly an airplane landings, 150 at the time appears maybe the charm. But I finally learned to land a plane. Okay, so
introduce you, or
I think everybody needs
to. Have someone else introduce.
All right.
For posterity.
Let's just do the official introduction. This is the blockchain meetup in October 2015. I hope I get the year right. And Dr. Peter Steinmetz, a local veritable expert in all things Bitcoin. Except Bitcoin, and it's an awesome place right heart of downtown Scottsdale here. So yeah, but Peter's going to be talking about in lecture 2 in his bit, which is focused on the blockchain and how transactions are included in blocks and all those sorts of awesome things. So,
all right, Peter. Thank you. Oh, I think on Bitcoin in detail, pretty much looking at the technical aspects of Bitcoin, and talked previously in the previous lecture about public and decryption, signatures, and so on, because that really is the basis of Bitcoin. In the lecture today, I'll start to talk about some of the components that are in the Bitcoin and how Bitcoin is put together, including the fundamentals of innovation, if you will, in Bitcoin itself. So we're really trying to solve the problem of, public entity, right, in such a way that everybody can encrypt to them, but only they can decrypt, right? And obviously, it's a fundamental problem for digital commerce on the internet, because you want transaction, but you want to be sure that you know the credit card number and the merchant knows the credit card number, but the people looking at the traffic over the internet don't know the credit card number. And if you consider a big company like Amazon, right? One of the problems is they have to be able to do this with thousands of people at once, right? So they can't really be in the business of calling everybody on the phone and agreeing. Right, in which you have basically 2 parts to a key, the public key and the private key, okay? That are the 2 parts needed. We also talked about hashes, right, which represent essentially digital digests, if you will, of a larger chunk of data. Okay, and we use a lot of SHA-256 which is a secure hashing algorithm. 256 is a hashing algorithm that's used a lot in Bitcoin. It produces from a block of data as large as you want to compute it over 256 bits, okay, which are relatively unique. And one of the functions of secure hashing functions is that if you know the data, it's almost impossible to compute what the data was of a particular link that would give rise to that hash. Message just means hash, but you can take a message and find its hash very quickly. Okay?
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
What do you say it's almost impossible? What is it not impossible?
Well, there is some finite probability that you could guess.
Okay.
Okay? It's 1 and 2 to the 256th power, which is about 10 to the, the logarithm base 2 of 10 is about 3.2. So you divide by 3.2, so it's about 10 to the 90th, which is about 10 to the 30th times more than number of elementary particles. Chance that you could guess, but you know, I mean, I'm a scientist, so I don't. So we combine, you know, in Bitcoin, one of the things we do is we combine the idea of, you know, a public key and hashes essentially to create what are called digital signatures. Or you need a private key too, right? So you can sign something digitally. I mean, hash over it, okay, and then you encrypt the hash. Now the only person, now anybody the hash, decrypt the encrypted hash with your public key because you encrypted it with your private key, okay? So if you encrypt the private key, you decrypt with the public key, and vice versa, okay? So what they can do is anybody can take that encrypted hash and decrypt it with your public key. If the hash now agrees with the hash of the message that you compute, you know that the only person who encrypted that hash is the guy who held the private. Okay, so that's essentially how you create digital signatures, and those are used. Tokens you can transfer between people. Okay, so some sort of a digital token that I can send to you and you can send to me over the internet. We can share by a variety of means, right? You want to have a current location where that token lives, okay, essentially, that's identified by a public key of a public-private key pair. And if you do that, right, if you think about that, if the location is represented by the public key, okay, we can then agree that the only way to transfer the token from that location to another location is by signing a message. And verify using the public key that it was signed correctly. Okay. All right. So you can distribute the public keys as long as they correspond to the locations. And then anybody can say, okay, that message right there that says transfer, you know, the coins from this address to that address, okay, it's got a digital signature on it. Okay. And anybody can look at that and verify the signature of the person who held the corresponding to the public key. They come in pairs. That's sort of the basic idea of how you control the flow of Bitcoins, okay? And then what you do is you can have a chain of these transactions, okay, that essentially transfer it. So, you know, you have the location where the token lives, okay, and to move it, say, from where it is to sign, essentially, the transaction that says where it should go, okay, to the next address or public key that it's going to belong to. And so then you can chain these on. This is how Bitcoins are essentially transferred from one owner, owner 1, owner 2, and then can be transferred again to owner 3. Okay. Does it make sense to people? Questions about that? I mean, it's maybe a little abstract. Right? Okay, but so the locations where Bitcoins live, the Bitcoin addresses, have to correspond to the public key of this private public key pair. And that's exactly what happens. If you know the public key in Bitcoin, you can derive the address that it corresponds to. And of course, in public key cryptography, if you know the public key, you can't figure out the private key, right? None of that would work if you could figure out the private key from a public key. Everything would fall apart, right? And the keys are designed in a very special way so that knowing the public key doesn't tell you the private key. Okay? All right. So, I mean, that's sort of the fundamental idea. Now, another fundamental idea is, so you can do these transactions, right, where you essentially, now how do you make sure that everybody has the same record? Okay, because like I could have maybe a certain address, I could create 2 transactions, one giving them to Dave and one giving them to Selby. Okay, all right. One's going to be the valid one. Okay, so you know, Dave on these Bitcoins. Here's the transaction. I got this transaction signed by this idiot Steinmetz, okay, who apparently also tried to sell them to me, okay? So you've got to have some way, right, to keep track of what are the valid transactions, okay? Which ones are going to be considered part of the official record, okay? And so one way to solve that problem, right, would be to have some central authority, right, okay? So we'd appoint Morpheus as the arbiter. He would keep track of all of the official transactions. Okay. And so if you wanted to know, you want to solve the two claims, the salt your data on these Bitcoins, you go to Morpheus and say, good, but the problem is, obviously, depends on that central authority, right? And that central authority becomes a point of attack. Okay, so if we're interested in creating a system, right, vulnerability of one person or attacked by a government, right? Somebody could arrest Morpheus and say, we're not going to ever let you out of prison unless you transactions or tell us where you got them or something like that. Okay. One of the objectives of Bitcoin was to essentially have some sort of a way to exchange these digital tokens, which was beyond the reach of any government. So how do you do that? Well, one solution is a consensus network. Okay. Basically, we have a network of nodes. Okay, that maintain a list. In Bitcoin, right, is that there's a whole bunch of nodes, and we'll talk about that actually in the Bitcoin network. I think it's the next lecture item for this one. There's a whole bunch of nodes, and essentially what you do if you want to find out what are the valid ones is you take a vote. This is the valid blockchain. That's what you're going to work on. Tokens, right? Because you can just create these tokens anytime they want to, right? Then there's no scarcity, and so it's not going to hold value, right? Produce, 10,000 total digital tokens, okay, and he's going to distribute them to the rest of us. But of course, that's susceptible to a whole bunch of problems, right? Central banking is a perfect example, okay, where you have people that, eventually the system gets corrupted, so that there are incentives for people to create new tokens out of thin air, okay? So one of the ways you get around that, right, in Bitcoin, we control it by a proof of work, okay? In other words, you have to show that you did a certain amount of computational work, okay? And so then the cost of doing that computational work essentially ideas. So as I was saying earlier, if we go into a little bit more detail on these ideas, right, the locations of the tokens, okay, in the Bitcoin network are Bitcoin addresses, okay? And so going back to what I was saying before, you have a key pair, okay? This is where you start, and this is the public key, okay? And this is a lot of technical encryption that's used. It's called elliptic curve cryptography, which is what's used in Bitcoin. The key consists of two numbers, X and Y, okay, which are integers. And what you do is you put those into these 32 bytes. You compute first the compute that. So you've reduced 65 bytes to, I think it's 8 bytes for a SHA-256. And then you compute another hash. So usually in Bitcoin we do a hash of a hash, okay? In this case, we compute a 160-bit hash called RYPTOGRAPHY of the 256 bits, okay? And then that gives us essentially these 20 bytes, okay? So I guess, right, that makes sense. 160 bits is 20 bytes, right? And then you add the network ID byte. So you put for the main network, you put 0 for testnet, you put a 6F. Coin, okay, but just slightly different is by appending different numbers here on the network ID. Okay, now you got 21 bytes. You compute the SHA-256 of those 21 bytes. Okay, so you reduce it again down to 8 bytes from 21. And then you take those 8 bytes and you compute again the SHA-256. So it's a 2 hashes again. Okay, And let's see, so then we add, we also take, what is it, I guess these are the 21 bytes. Confusing, what he means by that.
You can take some portion of the SHA-36 hash.
Oh, you compute a checksum over this, and then that's the 4 there? That's right, yeah, you add the checksum. So the last 4 bytes, right, of a bit to convert it, okay? And then that gives you this alphanumeric string, okay, which represents essentially these 25 bytes, okay, that are present in the
What does that mean, 1 and 0? Byte is a
Bit is a 1 and a 0. Byte is 8 of those. So like 1, 0, 0, 0, 1, 0, 0, 0. That's a byte.
so it has 8 possibilities.
2 possibilities in each bit.
Right.
So 256 possibilities in a byte. If you think about it, right? Because it could be, think about it, could be 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, right? 8 zeros.
Right.
Then you can change the last one, 1. Then 1, 0, 1. And right, and
And there's
there's 256 such
in that
in 1 byte.
in each one.
Right, and so then in 20 bytes, there would be 256 raised to the 20th power possible combinations. Actually, technically, these 25 bytes.
Yeah, but just so I understand.
Yeah.
Just so I'm-
No, go ahead.
Is the private key computed, I mean, is the public key computed from the private key?
Yes,
Yes.
in Bitcoin, in the cryptography we use, you can derive the public key from the
So
private.
when they're, this right here.
This X and Y are,
So they're basically shortening
The public,
address,
yeah.
because the public key is actually really, really, really big, and they're like, we just shorten.
But I mean, how are they, what's the mechanism that shows the link?
between the private and the public key.
Yeah, I mean,
It
so you
doesn't-
have to derive the public key from the private key.
Yes, but it is so that mechanism is this elliptic curve cryptography, right? Which involves computing numbers, okay, over certain finite fields, they're called. Okay, so it's like pretty. Essentially, is what it is. That's the important point. You cannot private key. Okay. Great. Okay. So this though is all just about the public key and turning it into a 25 byte number. Okay. And then this is just about representing those 25. I mean, you could send somebody an address as these 25 bytes. It's just messy. I mean, actually, you can send somebody an address as 20 bytes if they know the network it's on. But the one network you're on, okay, this and turn it into an alphanumeric thing, the last 5 digits you passed, right? Which has this nice property that and then making one mistake in here and then still having the same checksum are virtually impossible, right? It's not, I mean, you can figure out the odds, but it's very rare, okay? And it works as a valid address, almost certainly you got it right, okay? And that's why you and I always usually check the last 5 or whatever, right? Just we're checking the checksum essentially.
Does the private key also have a checksum in it?
No.
So your
Well, it depends on how it's represented, right?
Well, yeah, your private key. That's what I was going to tie this. Private key is usually a random number, so
Right.
this random number you can get. Yeah. So
It doesn't have one.
Right. I mean, it basically.
Well, no, it does when you pass them around. So, like some of the
Yeah.
representations in wallets, like you know, paper wallet, the
Yes.
private key is QR code.
Right.
Okay, And when they do that, I believe they include a checksum.
QRs have checks built.
Okay. Okay, yeah. So when you pass around a private,
Protocol, it's more here to how you feel like passing the number around. I think I should have 50 with checksum, just in case I had to type 50 wrong. So in this case, there's a really, really big number, and it's up to you to keep that.
So the private key doesn't need to have a check.
right, normally you're not passing them around,
Right,
right?
okay.
Except in very specific circumstances, right? Private keys, yeah, I mean, you know, maybe you put it on, it's just in the computer.
Right, either it works or it doesn't.
Yeah, you.
Private key is a Bitcoin, and then this is a way to find where that Bitcoin is. Or
The
a way
private
for
key.
everybody-
Yeah.
Yeah, I had a question. Maybe it's when you were showing the previous slide where the one owner is signing the transaction and then it's being transferred. So he can also access.
Since all of these transactions are incorporated into the blockchain and everybody can, the original owner still possesses his private key that he could use to try to sign a transaction transferring the Bitcoin to somebody else. So like I could sign, when I could send some Bitcoin to Dave. To do that, I sign using the private key corresponding to the public. Okay?
So the blockchain is the thing that says.
Yes. Right. That keeps you from double. It's about how you get this public key. Okay? Sign to transfer the Bitcoin. Okay, so what are you going to need to do that? Well, you're going to have inputs. They're called inputs. Where are the Bitcoin coming from? What addresses do they live at now? Okay. You can also take and move these tokens, okay, or parts of a token to different places. So like if I own 1.1 to Dave, 0.3 to Morpheus, and the remainder, 0.7 I have outputs. Every transaction can contain multiple inputs where the Bitcoins are coming from, multiple outputs where they're going to, and the sum of the outputs has to be less than address. And I want to send Morpheus 0.3. Morpheus only 0.3. What am I going to do with the other 0.7? Okay, I got to send them somewhere. Okay, because I've got one Bitcoin. Okay, I have to transfer. You know, the 0.3 has to be one of the outputs, but there's 0.7 left. Okay, if I want to keep that 0.7, I send it back to one of my own addresses. Okay, that's called a change address. Okay. So you basically have an output that corresponds to sending parts of the input back to yourself. But there could be less outputs than there are inputs. Okay? So I could just send 0.3 to Morpheus and do nothing and have one Bitcoin input. That would be okay. And what happens is, I'll talk about that in a minute. But anyway, the difference between the sum of the outputs and some of the inputs is the transaction fee for doing that transaction. And you can include change outputs as part of the transaction. Then for every input that is going into a transaction, you have to sign the transfer of it with the private key corresponding to where the token currently is, to its current public Bitcoin address. Okay, that's how you control the transfer. Okay, only the person who has the private key corresponding to that public address is allowed to transfer the Bitcoin off the address. Okay? All right, so they create a digital signature then for those particular inputs. You package all this together and you have a transaction. All right? So how is this actually by using what's called a scripting language? Okay, and basically what this scripting language allows is particular things like take the input, take this particular input, okay, with this many Bitcoin, do that. Usually what you do is you say, here are the inputs, here are the outputs, okay, and now there's other operations like check transactions, okay, which basically then turns around and says, okay, I'm going to go and see if all the signatures are valid on the inputs, okay, or check the signature, okay, so this is like the bytes that actually live, okay, and so you'll have some little bit of script and then a couple more and some checksums and so on. Let's see here, transaction input 0, transaction input 1, okay. The signatures, okay, and the checking of the signatures, okay, of the transfers from the public addresses that are involved. And then you have the output, okay, where the bit together these inputs and outputs and their representation in this scripting language. It gives you a whole sequence of bytes that are essentially the transaction, okay? And Bitcoin meetup where I talk about advanced wallet uses. So, one of the things that you can do sometimes, like if you're using the Qt client, you'll end up, because you try to send somebody some Bitcoin but not connected to the Bitcoin network very well, your transaction sort of hangs there. It's like it doesn't get broadcast through any nodes, nothing happens to it. But what you can do is you can actually go and retrieve the binary representation TX is their API for it. They send this. Okay, and then you got blockchain.info's website and its connectivity to the Bitcoin network, which is very strong. Okay, right? In fact, I did that to your transaction just earlier today because I made a mistake and sent it without having good connectivity. So I just copied it and went to blockchain and sent it because I knew you wanted Bitcoin. Push TX, yeah.
So you can take,
You can copy that.
is that like on mycelium or is it only in?
I don't know.
It's on my server.
Okay, but is there another way, like,
Could you get it?
what wallet were you using when you sent that to me?
Bitcoin Qt.
Okay, you're using the Qt.
And then you take out its console under the debug menu.
Okay, so
Yeah.
it's pretty complex.
And then you just.
It tells you how many confirmations you have.
Yeah.
If you click that, the network will tell you that and there's a blockchain.info/decode/TX.
Okay.
You paste that hex in and it'll spit JSON out.
Yeah.
It's human readable
Of what?
for you and will
What were the inputs? What's the output?
exactly.
But so that the issue then with blocks is basically block bundle transactions together for inclusion in this consensus set that's going to be maintained. Blocks. It's continuously. That's really what's going on, right? And so an individual block, the basis of it is a bunch of transactions, which are shown down. What transactions may be included in that block is first you to a tree until you have a thing called the root hash. Okay, this root hash corresponds uniquely, essentially, to this tree. It's called a miracle tree. To this hash of tree of hashes, all the way down to hashing transactions. Yeah.
So when they're doing the block, they're doing mining. This is what the process is. They take one
They
transaction.
bundle together a bunch of transactions that they've received from the network.
Mhm.
Okay, they compute this numerical tree in the root hash. They compute the hash of, or retrieve it. Yeah, you don't. Yeah, they retrieve the hash of the block they're trying to build on. Okay, and then they have to add a number called. Talk about this in the next slide. Right. So,
Yeah.
once you bundle all this together, now what they have to do is create a number called the nonce, which when placed in the header of this block, okay, and hashed, okay, with SHA-256, produces a certain number of leading zeros in the hash. Okay? That's mining. Figuring out what the
So when the miner and let's say an Antminer S4 is like 2,000 gigahertz per second.
Right.
Does that mean it has to do all those hashes for all those individual things?
Yeah, so remember that.
So it's not just a one, they don't just combine all transactions in.
If I have this, okay, plus this number called the nonce that I'm going to put in here, you can compute that. If I know all this data, I can easily compute the hash, okay? There's no way, or it's virtually impossible to know what number to put in here to produce a hash with a certain number of leading zeros.
Right.
Okay? The hash functions are sort of only one way. Okay? When I hash it, is to try in succession every possible nonce. Start with 0, compute this hash of all this stuff with that 0 in there. Put a 1 in there, compute a hash. Put a 2 in there, compute a hash. So what the miners are doing is repeatedly trying 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, right, at 2, whatever, 4 giga hashes per second.
And because header to guess at the nonce, you don't have to hear that little machine that's going really fast. Usually on those miners, they're just super.
Right.
So you.
The root hash is determined by the transaction.
Usually
Yeah.
we'll
The
count
pool, yeah.
that with a header and say here's
That's gonna determine once.
Yeah.
So when they add, well, it's like these guys, they're doing their thing when another transaction, so they're processing like 1,000 transactions. Then I do a transaction, now they got 1,001.
No, they're going to
if
keep
they want to stop.
but they don't generally. They're going to
At what point do they add my transaction into that block?
when the next block. Yeah, they don't.
If you ever seen like you go to blockchain the info, you'll with 0 transactions, even though even in times when we've been doing these
They didn't want to bother to calculate.
Right.
The root hash was,
Yeah.
you know, SHA-256 twice of nothing,
nothing.
right?
Yeah.
The previous hashes would have less. I mean, those are. They wouldn't do that.
Yeah.
So with all I don't mining, because like the miners and the specialized hardware, they could recompute the root hash and then slip that in and start doing their mining on that.
Imagine
And then
this, you
they
have
probably,
one, you have one or several central computers that are looking for transactional memory. These aren't miners, they're not specialized memory. Just, they see a new transaction come in, they get a second, if they can rehash this, you know. Mission critical for the transactions all. Much They really want to get the transaction done. That's why fees are so
Fees,
great,
yeah.
because hey, a half Bitcoin fee came in.
They're
Might
gonna
have stopped your
self-renewing.
engine.
Yeah, right,
Because
right.
you're gonna hash,
Yeah.
that's the transaction, it's gonna
Yeah.
make us half a Bitcoin.
Anyway, there's another lecture on mining, so we've kind of gotten off on mining.
Sorry.
I mean, the basic idea of mining is to find the nonce that's going to give you the required number of leading zeros, right? And there's a lot of strategy to how you do that most effectively. And
But I mean, it still takes some, I mean, if you have these machines that are doing, 2 trillion.
two to the 256th, okay? And your chances, depending on the number of leading zeros that are required, your chances, right? If you only require no leading zeros, I
forget.
yeah, I think it's 8 bytes or something. It's reasonable size.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And remember, if you can't guess it, you just do another transaction.
Yeah. Win the race, essentially, and mine the block, you can change the difficulty, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, because say that out of the 256 bytes of the hash, we required the first 255 to be 0. Well, how many possible values are there of the hash?
10.
No, 2, right? 1 bit. The last bit can be either 0 or 1. Well, you can guess that really quickly, right? Because there's only two possibilities. Okay, so the larger the number of leading zeros required, the easier the problem is. The fewer the number of leading is, okay? Because your chances of getting a hash, since it's random from the nonce you put in and the rest of the data, what the hash is, essentially it's just a random pick out of the 2 to the 256, okay? The space that will work with a certain number of leading zeros, right, determines your chances of winning. Or how many random nonces you're going to have to try in order to find one that works. Okay, so that's how the right on the Bitcoin network. What we're changing is the number of required leading zeros. Okay, in order to essentially mine a block. Okay. So if you think about it, right, this now creates essentially the chain of blocks, right? You've got this block, and for every block, you've got the hash of the previous block, except, of course, for the Genesis block, where the program ignored that, okay? But other than that, you always have the hash of a previous block, the nonce and all the transactions, and that then the miner who valid nonce send himself, okay, the Bitcoins that are in the block reward, right? So right now, if you mine a block successfully, you also get to make a transaction, it's called the Coinbase transaction, and include it in the block, which sends those 25 Bitcoin to an address you control, okay? All right? Yeah, there's only one Coinbase transaction.
Signature required for that, right? Because it's.
Yeah, you don't need a signature,
Right,
right?
your signature is essentially a solid block.
Right, right.
And you can't spend it with 100 blocks.
100 blocks, yeah. Unless you were at Mount Gox.
Miners did not realize
Yeah.
that.
Oh, really?
Some shiny homes really ugly.
Yeah. But anyway, so now you compute the hash of this as the pre-hash of the next block, right? So that's how you get a chain of blocks that are connected by this previous block hash that's included in every valid block. Okay? All right, so this is just some information about the current blockchain now has 378,769 blocks as of a little bit earlier today. Okay, currently consumes about 54 gigabytes if you include all transactions, okay, in your data. So you know, since the blocks are in a chain, if you have a transaction, right, we call the number of blocks past the block containing the transaction that have been mined the number of confirmations, okay? So because what could happen, right, is that you could have two, right? And once in a while on the Bitcoin blockchain, you'll actually get this situation where somebody might and people may even add another block on there, okay? but eventually everybody moves back over onto the main chain. So you get these little short side, okay, but eventually they get ignored by the rest of the blockchain. So if your transaction, right, if somebody had tried to, what we would call a double spend attack on you, forks, there was a transaction sending, again, the Bitcoin to Dave, and another fork sent him to Salty, right? Temporarily, it's sort of an unclear state who really owns those Bitcoin, right? So if you guys had maybe given me something of great value physically, which I could run away with and never be seen again with, this could be a bad situation if you were basically exchanging Bitcoin for something of great value. Okay, so you want to be sure that the transaction transferring the Bitcoin to you isn't off on this little fork side that isn't going to be the main blockchain. But if you wait like 6 blocks until your transaction is buried 6 blocks in the blockchain, the odds now of there being another transaction on a little fork are vanishingly small. Okay.
So is that what they do when they take your Bitcoin here? Is they wait?
No, because they're only selling you $5 worth of food, right? So they just want to see the transaction broadcast on the network.
Confirmations, that is kind of trivial.
They also, use, I mean, there may be advantages and disadvantages to using the service, but I believe BitPay has an unbelievably strong connection to networks. Like one, and then once they get yours, it's going to blast it out, so it'll be hard for you to double spend.
Yeah, they do advanced verification consensus on how before it comes out, just to make sure there's almost no nodes that could possibly
Right.
extra transaction.
Yeah.
What happens to those transactions, valid transactions that are in the
On the fork?
on the fork, which will be discarded?
Yeah, they're just essentially discarded. Nobody pays any attention to them.
Okay.
I mean, there's still
come back to the team.
So if they're still valid, say the fork's here, and
Oh,
for
yeah,
some reason
they could be included in
there's
another
2
block.
separate sets of transactions here, but this one's valid here and this one's valid here, but they're not sending the same inputs. And say this fork, the valid transactions, and just put them back on the network because they're still valid.
So those transactions go into a pending pool of transactions?
Well, they are essentially,
They're
yeah.
called the mempool, but this happens so very little that it just usually happens automatically. In fact, when it forks, the valid transactions will usually be on both forks side by side all the time, and the only difference would be a purposeful, probably double spend. And people can detect those pretty quick, just looking at the network.
So that's what number of confirmations is essentially. If you want to save storage space, like the full a phone or even a smaller computer, right, might have. I mean, if I transfer Bitcoins to Dave and then Dave subsequently transferred them to Morpheus, and now Morpheus is going to transfer them to Salty, and you want to verify whether the transaction, you don't care a whit about the fact that I originally had that Bitcoin and transferred it to Dave. Okay, so all you care about in the blockchain actually is what's called the set of unspent outputs. Okay, the outputs that could be moved somewhere else. Okay, and sold or moved to somebody else. Okay, so like in my example, the output that I had when I transferred the Bitcoin is no longer unspent. Okay, it's spent. Okay, so all you really need is this smaller set called the UTXO set. Okay, and then you can just look through the UTXO set, and if somebody's trying to transfer some Bitcoin outputs to you, and it's not in the UTXO set, there's a problem. Okay, you know that that's not a valid transaction. Okay, so you can get by with this smaller thing. It's a mode called Simplified Payment Verification, or SPV. Okay, that can be used on mobile devices and so on if you want to verify a transaction right on the device, rather than don't want to be doing that, right? Even if you can afford to put the 54 gig on your hard drive, okay, to verify a transaction, you don't want to have to go through the whole 54 gig looking for where are the outputs coming from, okay?
Yeah, for reference, the Bitcoin reference plan, I think has changed their backend store and how they store that.
Yeah,
content.
they're
So
pruned.
set and their blockchain set 3 times. Berkeley DB, I can't remember
Yeah.
what the starting one was, and now it's.
And the switch from Berkeley DB caused that hard fork because there was a problem. Yeah,
It is
so
faster.
yeah. So essentially then, you know, Bitcoin is this very clever solution, right, on how to digitally create and transfer these value tokens, okay? Public key cryptography is used to ensure the transfer owner, okay? You can basically, because of the scripting language, you can actually create arbitrarily complex transactions. So you can have multi-sig, okay, where basically to spend a certain set of Bitcoin in a certain set of outputs, you have to have 3 digital signatures instead of just 1, okay, so you can construct basically more elaborate things. I think Salty, you've actually used that, right, for some clients and so on, multi-sig, where, yeah. So and they do that by changing the number of Bitcoin that are in the block robot, right? So when Bitcoin first started, you got 50 to 12.5 Bitcoin every time you successfully mine a block. So it's going to be a gradual decrease. What does that mean in terms of incentives for mining, right? It's going to, they're always going to be there. They don't depend on that block reward, right? It's distributed network consensus, okay, where essentially you ask for, you know, if you want to know if a block is valid, right, you're seeing how many nodes you're getting it from, and that basically allows us to avoid having to have a trusted party, okay?
Blocks put together by somebody else and given the miners.
No, the miners put together their own blocks. So they look at the transactions that are on the network. It's transaction fee. In fact, one time I was using this thing. There, the program, and it accidentally didn't include like the proper number of change outputs, and so I accidentally had, like, I was broadcasting a transaction that had like at the time it was like a 3 Bitcoin fee, transaction fee. Man, that thing was gone in a flash. I mean, I'm sure some miner just threw everything away. Take that.
Like I said, sometimes you spot one that's a lot of Bitcoin, they hope the miners include it in the root hash and then tell them to go ahead.
Yeah.
So only one miner can take a transaction?
What's that?
Only one miner can take a
No,
transaction?
no, everybody's
So
mining on the
everybody's
same set.
mining, but only one wins.
The first one to broadcast the nonce that gives the number of zeros.
Okay.
Okay.
The block, they're the only ones who can get the fees for all the transactions included in that particular block. So yeah, only one can get the transaction fee.
Oh, that's a good
everyone else
point.
is trying to
Right.
raise.
Mhm.
Right. Unless, and then if it works, they can, anyway,
If it forks, but that's why there's a 100 block delay. Because otherwise you'd have this problem of what if you tried to, if you have sure that you can words on the fork.
So specialized to be able to mine blocks once the Bitcoin reward effectively goes near to 0. That there's only a few
Well, we're already
left, and then those few
colluded to do that,
Yeah, it's
right?
also
Because you
devalue the crap out of your mining equipment.
right.
And supposedly, Bitcoin will be worth a certain amount in the value of transactions it does per day or whatever it works at that time. But everyone will want to include a fee to keep the miners happy. Now that fee may be very little.
Mm-hmm.
Or it might have to be a lot because we're still doing 2 megabyte blocks or
Right,
something.
right now.
So
Where does the reward come from?
Where does the reward come
Yeah,
from?
the Bitcoin they mine, it comes from nowhere.
Well, I mean, when you mine, right? So if those Bitcoin have value, it's your reward.
And it's a rule in the protocol how everyone determines what the difficulty should be. So when you solve a block, you say, I solved it with this difficulty, here's my zeros in my hash, so give me the reward. And the whole network goes, you're came from nothing, Coinbase reward for you, because we all agree this is our protocol. Our protocol says we're going to have
Bitcoins that we adopted.
Yeah, so
Yes,
so
essentially.
it's like a bogus transaction that everybody agrees to pretend is
Right,
valid,
right.
basically, right? It's not really valid.
In fact,
It's,
if you want to know how much Bitcoin is technically out there now, portion times 25 since the half has happened.
Yeah.
That's how many Bitcoins are in circulation. Those are gone, you can't really know how this is. Yeah, I mean, so it's pre-programmed in there where the magic comes from. So it's magic, but also it's magic, so it's part of it.
Can you talk about 50% attack, 51% attack?
Okay, well, so yeah, so the idea in a 51% attack, right, would be that you control enough of the mining. Okay, 51%. No, it's like the nodes, right? It's like 51% of the nodes.
So we talk about blocks, forks, racing each other, right? Oh, they're racing, and everyone can see it's racing, everyone knows. I'm not sure, my confirmations don't mean, but I don't know which side all my transactions will be on. Well, in a 51% attack, you run into all kinds of weird situations. For example, an attack with 51% means on average, over a period of time, they're going to eventually be able to get, I don't know, 3 blocks ahead of everybody, but they can just not tell you.
Right.
Maybe they don't care about the reward. Maybe what they're trying to cheat that Bitcoin they can get for releasing these blocks. So they withhold it until prime time, and bam, they double spin it, and suddenly the fork is 3 blocks ahead of the other one, everyone switches over, and the double spin successful. The reason why it's supposedly not feasible is 1, the block reward's high compared to what you would double spin. 2, everyone would detect it. 3, would devalue the hell out of the network. And 4, without everyone realizing what the hell's going on.
Yeah.
Now you say that that's all in theory. There's been a situation 2 or 3 times now since the dawn of Bitcoin
Mm-hmm.
where 51%, and everyone got scared, and in general, nothing really bad happens.
Did they hold
Well,
more than 50?
network-
Did they hold 51%, or did they hold like 39 or something? And so people were worried.
No, there was a period where someone held 39,
Yeah,
and they were close enough with another one that held like 21.
Yeah.
It was like this, they could easily glue it and knew each other well enough.
Yeah.
In their case, I can't remember the name of the miner now.
Hmm.
They were the really big ones that had 50.
Oh, yeah,
at some
yeah.
point, and they were double spending against Satoshi guys.
Oh,
They
okay.
were caught double spending against Satoshi guys. They
Huh.
made something like in their mining pool, and they had mostly no power, but they were cloud based. Anyway, it all evened out in the end, and the people that got screwed were the gamblers. So it's sort of unfortunate. Not likely to happen again, but you can't control the miners. You can only sort of just watch out for what's going on.
Mm.
Now, when I was in the middle of the foray when all that was happening. All we did was wait for 20 confirmations for everything.
Mhm.
Or in the case of like a sub-hard fork, which can be like a software error, which just happened. We're going to wait until this fork resolves, usually within 24 hours. Very rare for that to happen. In fact, I would suspect it's increasingly unlikely to happen as time goes on.
Yeah, that was pretty early on.
Super duper
Yeah.
hard to fork the network now. I mean, just look at the block
Yeah.
size consensus.
Yeah.
It's like, no.
Yeah, I mean, back in the old days, it was which was 2 years ago. It was easier for these things to happen, but at the same time, people just came together and fixed it too.
So, yeah.
So on these softwares, people just voluntarily said, oh, okay, yeah, that's a problem. I'm going to roll over to this software. Or everybody was running the other stuff just said.
Production experiment right now.
Right.
But if you just want to Google, I don't know if you have the internet, known problems on the Bitcoin Wiki, which is, the developers, core developers are listing out these problems. These are known problems that are probably not going to be a big deal, known problems that are sort of a big deal, known problems like 27 things, and some of them are terrifying. The thing is, it's so infeasible for any of them to actually occur that nobody's running around with their hair on fire, but at any moment, your hair could get on fire.
Yeah. That's like watching the.
I'm gonna shut down. I think the live feed at this point.
Okay, yeah.
If we're done, it's been about an hour, and I'll stop the broadcast
Sure.
now. Okay.
I think it's done at the bottom.
There's a
Oh.
button at the top, so